Imagine a young woman has just left work for the day and she's on her way home. It's a warm summer day and an older gentleman has just sat next to her in a cramped stagecoach. And the coach goes over a bump and the man next to her gets a little closer. She doesn't think too much of it. And then there's another big bump and the man next to her gets a little closer. And now they're hip to hip. And he makes no move to separate. And that's odd. And there's another big bump. And now he puts his arm around her. That's it. She's had enough. She reaches up to her hat and she pulls out her only defense, her hat pin. And that is the one thing she knows that will make this man back off. A 9-inch, pointed at one end, ornate at the other, pin, and she jabs him with it in the arm. The masher, as the man like this one would be called in the early 1900s, screams in pain and he backs off. This story is actually based on a true event of a young 20-something woman who moved from Kansas to New York City to work in a newly industrialized city in the 1900s. By the end of the 1800s and the start of the 1900s, the world was on the precipice of significant change. The Industrial Revolution had taken hold, and as the cities became industrialized, the population shifted. The rural areas moved into the cities. This meant changes in a variety of areas: social and cultural norms, fashion, environmental, educational, and political, just to name a few. Young women left their homes in the countryside, and they moved to the cities for opportunities to make their own money and their own way in the world. This is a significant shift in the cultural norms. Prior to this, women weren't allowed to go anywhere unchaperoned. Now, while living in the city, there's a new sense of independence, and a male chaperone is no longer welcome. The concept of dating begins during this time as opposed to what was happening before with courtship, when the young man would ask the father to court a young lady, and that would eventually lead to marriage. In the city, this doesn't happen. Ladies went to dances, they went to shops, they were starting to do things without parental supervision. Women began to wear rouge on their cheeks. Their hemlines rose scandalously high above their ankles. Oh dear. Due to these changes in women's fashion and unchaperoned behavior, there was an increase in the amount of attacks on women. According to the Chicago Vice Squad, women put themselves in danger by going out unchaperoned or wearing rouge or showing off their ankle. In essence, asking for the mashers, which was period slang for lecherous or predatory men, to making their advances. Of course, suffragists will counter this by saying it's not about fashion or women's increase in freedom, but the vileness of the masher. But what about these Hatpins? Why do women need them? Where'd they even come from? Actually, we can go back as far as the 1400s or the Middle Ages in Europe, when pins were used to keep wimples and veils of proper ladies in place over their hair. For the purposes of our discussion, though, 1800 is the time period that we want to look at. The pins was a part of the cottage industry. In other words, it was a good product that was produced in the home, and generally an entire family was employed in making the pins. As such, only so many could be made at a time, and so they were very expensive and it was very time consuming. So these were in high demand. By 1832, a pin making machine was patented and the production of pins with long tapering points began. In the 1850s, hat pins became a necessity in order to secure straw hats to your head. What really began the hat pin popularity, though, was when in 1903, music hall actresses like Lillian Russell and Lillian Langtry wore elaborate hats without bonnet strings. Those elaborate hats started a mini revolution. Many of the large hats that women wore during the early 1900s were made with bird feathers. And sometimes an entire bird or half of a bird was on that hat. Imagine that, and having to fit all of your hair underneath that hat. That, at the most, may have been trimmed but never really cut underneath that hat. Women never got haircuts. So the hat pin became a necessity. Manufacturers moved away from the bonnet strings and turned to hat pins to keep these hats on the heads of the women and jewelers. And artisans like Louis Tiffany took on the task of making very ornate and sometimes quite expensive hat pins. Some of these pins ranged in design from the Baroque style to Art Nouveau. Materials ranged from brass to copper to gold, and carnival glass and gems. They were given some hat pins that had a small mirror and powder puff inside them. Mass-produced hat pins generally had a white or black bead at the end of them, and those were known as the working girl hat pin. As all women had to wear hats and all of them had to wear pins, the working girl hat pin was the most accessible for the all economic classes, socioeconomic classes. Hat pins were kept on a woman's dressing table in a hat pin holder. These elaborate hats caused their own problems, though. In 1913, the Audubon Society was formed out of necessity, as nearly 60 species of birds were almost hunted to extinction for use on these women's hats. Some of the more popular bird hats were egrets, peacocks, herons, ostrich, and spoonbills. In fact, the spoonbill feathers were $80 an ounce, 3 times their weight in gold. Lobbyists in 1918 worked to get the Migratory Bird Treaty Act passed that made it illegal to kill, sell, or transport certain birds or feathers as a direct result of this woman's fashion. Considering that these pins have to hold so much hair under a huge hat, the pins have to be sharp, and to some extent, quite long. How long is too long? As more accounts of women attacking men with their hat pins come about, cries for shortened hat pin lengths abound. From New York City to Chicago to St. Louis, women were using their hat pins for self-defense to poke, stab, and drive away those mashers. But then there were some accidents. A 19-year-old girl from Scranton was fooling around with her boyfriend and thrust her hat pin at him. She pierced his heart, and he died. Another account claims that a New York streetcar rider felt a prick behind his ear from a woman's hat pin accidentally, and he fell into a coma, and he died within a week. Slowly across the country and the globe, the hat pin became viewed as a deadly weapon. In fact, in 1908, an English judge feared pins could be used as a weapon in his courtroom, so he ordered a group of suffragettes on trial to remove their hat pins and their hats, which was an insult to the women. In 1909, a bill was introduced in the Arkansas State Legislature that copied an Illinois law limiting the length of pins to 9 inches. Or, ladies had to take out permits to possess longer pins. In Chicago, the fine was $50 if your hat pin exceeded 9 inches. Hat pins could range in length from 6 to 12 inches. Now, in most major cities, women had to trim their hat pins down to 9 in order to wear them in public. Even in Sydney, Australia, there were fines for wearing a hat pin over 9 inches. 60 women decided to go to jail rather than pay the fine. But are they deadly weapons? Or is this a means of controlling women? Take into consideration the years. 1909, the suffrage movement is amping up in the country across the globe. Many suffragists saw the hat pin controversy as a means of keeping women down. This is but another argument for women and another painful illustration of the fact that men cannot discipline women. Women need discipline, They need to be forced, if not led out of their barbarisms, but women never have and never will submit to the discipline of men. Give women political power, and the best among them will gradually train the uncivilized, just as the best among men have trained their sex, stated Harriet Stanton Blatch, daughter of Elizabeth Cady Stanton. In the meanwhile, World War I, the Great War, breaks out, and everything changes. Medals were used for the war, hats became smaller. Fashions changed and women cut their hair. Right after the war. Once the bob haircut made its debut, the cloche hat became popular. The large, over-bedecked hats were out of style, and the hatpin craze had run its course. Men had to contend with women showing more than just a little ankle, as the flapper era had begun, and the right to vote for women had been won with the 19th Amendment, which was ratified in August of 1920. Come on by the Seymour Historical Society and see our collection of hatpins. Have a great day. Thanks.